Good morning. Welcome to the Farris News Network. Today we will be talking about events occurring during the past few years, 1852 to 1854. With us today is a special guest, Harriet Beecher Stowe. We also have many other features, including a commentary about the election of 1852 and two news segments about the Ostend Manifesto and the Gadsden Purchase. Our first segment today on our news broadcast, an interesting interview with Harriet Beecher Stowe, an amazing novelist that changed our idea of slavery today with her world-renowned Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Welcome to the Years in Review. Today we'll be talking to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. This book carries a huge message about slavery and made many aware of the horrors of slavery. Harriet, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us about your love of writing.
Since I was a child, I have enjoyed writing. I attended two schools, Ma'am Kilburn School and Litchfield Academy, before enrolling in my sister's school, Hartford Female Seminary, where I later became a teacher. When I was 12 years old, I wrote an essay titled, "Can the Immorality of the Soul be Improved by the Light of Nature?" When we moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, my sister opened a new school, the Western Female Institute. That was when I began to write professionally. My sister Catherine and I wrote and sold a geography textbook. I also wrote many stories.
When did you first start viewing slavery as wrong and unfair?
When I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio in 1832, I learned about the world of slavery from visiting Kentucky, which was a slave state. I witnessed slavery firsthand when I visited a plantation. I also talked to escaped slaves. This opened my eyes to slavery and made me begin to question it.
In 1851, your 18-month-old son died of cholera. I understand that this event had a big impact on your decision to write the book.
Yes, it did. In 1837, I married my husband, Calvin Stowe. We have 8 children together. In 1851, when my son died, we had a communion service at the Bowdoin College where my husband works. During the ceremony, I had a vision of a dying slave that really touched my heart. Afterwards, I began to write the book. I used my experience with slavery from visiting the plantation and talking with ex-slaves.
Tell us a little bit more about your book.
The book is completely fictional, but real in the way it portrays slavery. The story talks about the effects of slavery on families. The novel starts with the Shelby family having to sell 2 of their slaves, Tom and Harry, due to economic troubles. Harry is a child, so when his mother, Eliza, finds out that they are selling him, they escape to Canada for freedom. A slave catcher is here to find them, but they ultimately go to a Quaker settlement where the Quakers agree to transport them to safety. Meanwhile, Tom is taking a boat to be put on the slave market. He saves a girl named Eve St. Clair who fell in the river. Her father, Augustine, then buys him and they go to New Orleans. Tom lives with the St. Clair family for 2 years until Eve falls ill. Augustine decides to free Tom after she dies, but he is killed in a brawl before it happens. His wife Marie then sells Tom to a vicious plantation owner, Simon Legree. Tom is disliked almost immediately when he refuses to be a fellow slave. Tom is beaten and his trust in God is gone. But when he has 2 visions, one of Christ and one of Eva, it renews his spiritual strength. Soon, Tom is beaten severely when he refuses to tell Legree where a fellow slave is. The fellow slave, Cassie, escaped because Tom told her to. Tom forgives Legree and the overseer is beating him while on his deathbed. George Shelby, who originally sold Tom, comes to buy Tom's freedom, but is unfortunately too late. Tom dies a martyr. George goes back to his house and frees all of his slaves in memory of Tom. Cassie, Tom's fellow slave who escaped, reaches Canada and meets Eliza, the mother of the other slaves sold by George Shelby. They move to Liberia, which was created for former slaves. The book touches upon many controversial issues like the fugitive slave law, the cause of slavery, the future of slavery, racism, and what an individual can do to stop slavery.
As many know, this book has a huge impact on the Americans and even those overseas. Tell us more about it, Harriet.
The book has been pretty successful in portraying its message. The book came out on March 20th and sold 10,000 copies within the first week. In the North, many now understand slavery and are empathetic for the slaves. People in the South are outraged at the book, however. Many are saying that it is unrealistic, but I witnessed slavery firsthand and have used experiences to write the book. The book has also been very successful in Europe.
Thank you for coming, Harriet.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Harriet. That was a very interesting interview. Now on to the next segment of our program, a wonderful commentary by our very own Christopher Harlow. Today, he will be discussing with us the outcome of the election of 1852. Who won? What were the candidates? What was the platform of the candidates? Now on to the story, Chris.
We've had another election, and this means we've had more competition and found a new president. It was a toss-up to replace Millard Fillmore. This election saw three candidates. The first was Franklin Pierce, a Democrat from New Hampshire. The Whigs' choice for a candidate was Winfield Scott of New Jersey. In addition to the two major players in the election, the Free Soil Party also desperately attempted to grab at the presidency. Chose John Hale, also of New Hampshire. This man was relatively unimportant. He only got about 5% of the popular vote and no electoral votes, so I'll focus more now on the other two choices. Now a brief talk about how both were chosen to run. Franklin Pierce was a come-from-nowhere choice for the Democrats. In this election they were born because of all the controversial issues. For example, slavery tore the nation, and it was a hot potato to pass on rather than to talk about. This issue, among other minor ones, divided not only the nation, but individual parties. The Democrats could not find a candidate to appease all sides. They turned to a new man altogether, not one very well known, Pierce. Franklin Pierce's main selling point was his stance on issues. Everybody is usually a Southerner or a Northerner. He was a pro-Southern Northerner. Winfield Scott was chosen to run when Whigs met in Baltimore. Millard Fillmore may have been chosen, but he supported the Compromise of 1850, which was unfavorable to the Whigs. In addition, the Whigs wanted a war hero. Veterans had worked in the past when it came to popularity in elections. The popularity, for example, stemmed from his war past. A more recent example had been Harrison, winning mostly because he was a war hero and a common man. And so Scott was chosen. He had fought in the Mexican War, and this was his main selling point. This election was less like the older ones and more like the newer, most notably the Van Buren versus Harrison one. As I said before, issues were too hot to touch, and thus they weren't. Parties ordered candidates not to discuss issues. There was nothing to stand on in terms of these issues. The two candidates had no platforms to talk about, so the election naturally went to a simple catfight. Debates over real problems took a backstage to personality attacks. Pierce was accused of drunkenness and cowardice in the military. Scott was said to have dishonorably refused a battle with Jackson decades ago. All in all, it was only insults and petty fighting for popularity. As it turned out, Pierce won. He got roughly 1,600,000 votes to Scott's 1,380,000. Factoring in the aforementioned John Hale's votes, getting 5%, he got 155,000 votes. 50% of votes, while Scott held about 44%. In this way, it was close, but in terms of electoral votes, it was an easy victory. 254 electoral votes to 42. This ultimately led to Pierce's presidency and the eventual demise of the Whigs. If you want my opinion, I think Scott lost from the start. The Whigs were almost dead from this point, so it was just a feeble, dying grab for power. It also didn't help that he ignored orders and talked about slavery in spite of the Whigs' plans to shut him up. This also lost him some votes, to put it lightly. The problem with this is that while Pierce appeased both the North and the South, Scott was now attempting to appease the South. He also endorsed the Compromise of 1850, which in part was an effort to compromise pro- and anti-slavery. He therefore had two stances, somewhat, pro-compromise and pro-slavery. These contradicted each other. His popularity, even in the South, dwindled. Pierce avoided this, as Scott could have, by not campaigning at all. It could have been better for him, probably, as he may have been able to more effectively play the war veteran gambit without actually revealing too much of his bitter personality and views. You'll get it next time, Scott. Oh, never mind, the Whigs are gone. Well, thank you, folks. Now back to the news desk.
Thank you, Chris. That was a very compelling story there. Up next is Jamal, talking to us about this elemental purchase that allowed the U.S. to make internal improvements, such as railroads. As all of you very intelligent viewers know, our great country of America is very centered around the economic fashion of trading. The South makes their products, and the North ships them. Easy as pie. Now, what if we as a country could trade even more? Our new trading post on even the other side of the continent. That would greatly boost our American economy, which would make our country even stronger. Anyone who lives in America knows that at this time we own a lot of land. The United States extends all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It would be very difficult to travel from one side to the other by foot, or heck, even by horse. This would cause conflict in the art of trading across the nation. A great solution to this problem is the construction of railroads. These popular pieces of machinery are a surefire way to increase the rate of transportation across the country. We want to build these railroads in the best location possible. Many civilians have observed the West Coast and have found that the best location to open up a railroad is just below the border to Mexico. Gosh darn it, all we need is a tiny bit more territory and we can have the best railroad route to the Pacific in the whole country. So in the year 1853, our Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, sent none other than James Gadsden of South Carolina to Mexico. Once there, he would make negotiations with the notorious Santa Anna, who was our enemy during the war with Mexico, to gain new territory for our proud nation. First, the two agreed upon 45,000 square miles of territory, $15 million. However, because of disputes between the North and the South, a different treaty was signed. Finally, a deal was made on April 25, 1854, and an agreement came forth. In the Gadsden Purchase, as it came to be called, the United States would buy a small portion of Mexican land, 29,670 square miles, just below the border, for $10 million. This may seem like a lot of money, but it was worth it for the benefits of creating a new railroad. Now, all may seem right and organized with this purchase put in place, but hold your hats. The North thought that this deal was not an equal trade-off for the entirety of the country. They claimed that the South benefited more from it because the actual railroad would be in the South, and the northern region would have trouble gaining access to it. This is because they would have to travel through more mountainous areas and would also have to travel through the unorganized territory of Nebraska, which was crawling with natives. This gave the northern part of our country limited access to the railroad, and so the economy up there would suffer. However, the southern economy would be promoted to a higher standard. This economical change caused more differences between the North and the South and brought a greater influence of sectionalism upon our country. So now, America, how will you handle these unresolved conflicts? Will all of this fighting and arguing possibly lead to a war within our very country? Your unique opinion on this matter is up for you to decide. I will not try to muddy the waters of your thought process. No worries. I, for one, very dearly hope that we do not need to go to war. I truly enjoy peacetime, and a war within our own boundaries would be a terrible event. Anyway, that is all we have for you, fine citizens, today on the Gadsden Purchase. Here is another member of my newscast, Alexi Martin, with the Odston Manifesto, a shocking story coming straight from the Odston, Belgium, where U.S. Ministers Pierre Sol, Minister to Spain, and James Buchanan, Minister to Britain, and John Y. Mason, Minister to France, have met to discuss the possible purchase of Cuba from Spain for $120 million.
Thank you, Jamal. Here's an update on the pending Cuba crisis. Over the past few years, the U.S. has watched the predicament unfold. It all started with the Southerners dueling over the prospect of a large island just to the south of Florida. Cuba is its name. It is a large island owned by Spain that has a large population of enslaved blacks. Many Southerners thought this island could expand slavery by being broken into several slave states, therefore restoring the balance in the Senate. In response to public view, the thought of equality in Congress, President Polk offered Spain $100 million for the rich Cuba. Cuba declined this offer, not wanting anything to do with the U.S. This was the first attempt to gain Cuba. The next attempt came in the form of Southern adventures, fueled by Manifest Destiny. This was God's right for the U.S. to expand. These two missions were groups of armed men that went to Cuba to take it by force. They failed, and were put down by the Cubans. Another form of conflict that arose from Cuba was the seizure of the American steamer Black Warrior on the apparent customs technicality. This resulted in President Pierce taking it into his own hands. Breaking news, folks. The Cuba crisis has reached its boiling point with the revelation of the secret diplomatic document called the Onestad Manifesto. This document was drafted by 3 American ministers: Pierre Sol, minister to Spain; James Buchanan, minister to Britain; and John Y. Mason, minister to France, in Onestead, Belgium, in a last-ditch effort to buy Cuba from Spain. This document stated that the U.S. wished to purchase Cuba for $120 million from Spain. If Spain refused, then the U.S. would declare war on the country by forcibly taking Cuba from Spain's grasp. The U.S. justified this extreme action by saying that if Spain refused this proposal and the ownership of Cuba endangered American interests, that we had the right to the country. Here's some opinions from this document from our fellow citizens. An anonymous citizen from the South: by golly, with this purchase of Cuba, we could settle the numbers in Congress. Finally, the South could have more of a representation, equal as such, since California ruined it all. Cuba could be split into several states. More power to slavery, since the country's already stock full of them. The only reason this document was hush-hush was the North was going to ruin it for us. Okay, thank you. On to the Northern citizen. What is this nonsense? Onestead Manifesto. It is a last-ditch effort from the South trying to extend slavery. I am appalled that they would dip so low and justify themselves using backwards knowledge that this is blackmailing. It is a foreign country. Yes, I am all for manifest destiny and all, but it's our right to expand. But do people know that getting Cuba extends slavery? And that is humane. First, the Fugitive Slave Act, and now this, I am extremely angry. After that statement, one can see why the North is so angry. They even branded the whole document in a manifesto, a declaration of the South and Southern opinion. The South was going against what they were trying to prevent, the spread of slavery. The North even went as far as to denounce the document. Thank you, my fellow citizens. To wrap it up, here's a final word on this issue. We just heard extreme polarities of views from the North and the South. The Pierce administration dropped its schemes for Cuba completely. Cuba was never gained by the U.S., nor did we ever go to war with Spain to gain a rich country. The Cuba crisis is over for now, yet the issue of slavery still remains. Hopefully this will not lead to a civil war and yet cause another imbalance in Congress. Now back to the news desk for wrap-up.
Thank you all for watching and not changing the channel for our news report. I would like to give a big thanks to all of our participants today: Alexi Martin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Christopher Harlow, and myself, James Young. We hope we have provided some very beneficial information to our viewers. Well, that's all the time we have, folks. Tune in bright and early tomorrow morning for even more killer stories.